February 24, 2022. Russian helicopters swarm Hostomel Airport near Kyiv. Putin thought this would be quick, just a special military operation that would crush Ukraine in a matter of days. But Ukraine didn't crumble. Within hours, Russian troops were stuck, facing way more resistance than they ever expected. Putin's big plans for an easy win were falling apart fast. So how did one of the world's biggest armies mess up so badly, so quickly? It all started with Putin's arrogance and the disaster at Hostomel. The Hostomel Airport, known as the Antonov Airport, after the former Soviet company Antonov Airlines that operates it, is a combination military and cargo airfield located in a suburb just 6 miles northwest of Kyiv. This made it a unique target for the Russian invasion due to its relative proximity to the Ukrainian capital and the capacity to land large cargo aircraft, which would be perfect for military planes carrying Russian soldiers and equipment. In fact, the Hostomel Airport is the home base of the former largest aircraft in the world, the AN-225 Maria, meaning dream. This would make the airport a perfect base for a Russian air bridge, connecting the Ukrainian capital to Russia, where more forces could be airlifted into the country as needed. Additionally, since Kyiv is located relatively close to the Ukrainian border with Belarus, the latter would be used as the unofficial staging ground for the initial strike team. As a preamble to the operation that would devolve into a battle, the Russian military's first order of business was to make Hostomel approachable by air. At 700 hours, just an hour and a half after the announcement, the airport control and nearby military bases were targeted by a host of Caliber cruise missiles. The goal of the launch was to disable the radars between Belarus and Ukraine that would serve as an early warning system and compromise the operation. The extent of the missile salvo is unknown, but the systems were believed to not be damaged enough to go out of service. At 0930 hours, the Russian military in Belarus mounted the first wave of the attack, a contingent of between 200 and 300 Russian troops, believed to be from the 31st Guards Air Assault Brigade, the 45th Guards Spetsnaz Brigade, and the 11th Guards Air Assault Brigade, all elite paratroopers or special forces units, board 34 transport and attack helicopters, Mi-24s, Mi-8s and Ka-52s, in VD Bolshoi Bokov Airport near the town of Mazir, 100 miles north of Kyiv. The helicopters fly over the rivers Pripyat and Dnipro, the latter of which flows directly into Kyiv. To avoid the still functional radars, the Russian forces launch diversionary aircraft and the military start using jamming programs. Still, the helicopters are taking no chances and would fly just above the river surface, trying to go below the radar. Their efforts are successful, and they reach the Kyiv hydroelectric plant just north of the city. It's only then that the Ukrainian air defenses spot the incoming force and open fire, downing one Mi-24 and damaging a Ka-52. This would be the first mistake that the Kremlin made, right at the onset of the operation. It was thoroughly believed that the Ukrainian forces would move a bulk of its defense to the east and that the local troops would not present any resistance to incoming aircraft. The troops are not equipped enough to handle a prolonged gunfight, especially one in the middle of enemy territory, with Russian reinforcements on the way only via air. An already risky operation to decapitate the government relatively peacefully is now turning into an actual combat operation that the Russians never actually prepared for, making it practically doomed. But the invading helicopters have no way of turning back, and Putin is nothing but committed to the goal. With 2 aircraft down, the Russian invasion squads reach the airport at 10:30 hours. Russia's initial strike team would outnumber the Ukrainian defenses posted at Hostomel Airport. These were composed of 20 soldiers to the northwestern end of the runway, manning a Zu-23-2 anti-air autocannon and guarding the airport's radar array, as well as 180 men on the southeastern end of the runway near the barracks, armed with rifles and 9 K-38 Igla man-portable anti-air launchers. Furthermore, the initial Russian missile strikes targeted the radar and barracks but missed, putting the soldiers on high alert. The 2-mile runway is barricaded by vehicles, preventing any aircraft from landing safely. The local defenders are NATO-trained 4th Rapid Reaction Brigade of the National Guard. However, while the men received top-notch training, they were not experienced. The Ukrainian military already anticipated a Russian invasion, but believed it to be coming to the Donbass area, and so transported most of its elite units there. Thus, the defense of Antonov Airport would be left to the 200 soldiers for at least a few hours until reinforcements could arrive from Kyiv. The Russians started staging a landing mission at 1100 hours. Due to being unprepared for a defense force and the runway incapable of being landed on, the helicopters split up. The bulk of the attack helicopters go north to remove the radar and anti-air cannon, while the transports try to land near the barracks. Both Russians and Ukrainians open fire. Almost immediately, the Russians start taking losses. Helicopters are caught by anti-air rockets, with 2 crashing onto the runway itself and creating more debris, making it even less accessible than it was before. Downing the first Ka-52 with an Igla boosted the morale of the Ukrainian conscripts in the National Guard, spurring them to launch everything they had at the aircraft. 2 more helicopters would be downed by Ukrainian forces, this time crash landing outside of the airport. However, the attack helicopters created so much pressure on the Ukrainian military that they began running out of ammunition and were forced to fall back. The Russians land and disembark the helicopters on the north end of the runway and seize the anti-air cannon, with the 20 men guarding it surrendering. The remainder of Ukraine's forces fall back to the south into residential buildings surrounding the airport. Russia is therefore able to overwhelm the initial defenses and capture the Antonov Airport at 1300 hours, roughly 2 hours after the helicopters arrived. But this would be 2 more mistakes Russia would make in the battle. The original contingent of soldiers wasn't prepared to hold the airfield for an extended period. The Russian troops didn't even cause a single Ukrainian casualty. While the 20 soldiers that guarded the radar surrendered, the other 180 were able to regroup away from the airport. Additionally, the airport itself is on flat land, creating practically no cover for forces that would have to defend themselves from the ground. Worse yet, the Russian army decided to call the helicopters back, leaving only the remainder of the initial 300 paratroopers to occupy the airport. At this point, Russia was planning to create the aforementioned air bridge to Kyiv, starting with 18 transport jets departing from the Pskov Airport, 500 miles north of Hostomel, and carrying roughly 1,000 soldiers on what should be 2 hours of unimpeded flight to Ukraine. Another report suggested that the reinforcements numbered as many as 5,000 troops on board 41 Il-76 planes that were spotted flying in the Belarusian airspace. These reinforcements would be more than enough to overwhelm the 180 soldiers stationed around the airport and make headway into the capital to take control of the Ukrainian government. The second wave of Russian reinforcements would come by road in the form of mechanized infantry squads traveling from Belarus to Kyiv. However, they were experiencing their own set of difficulties fighting through 2 military bases on the way. Luckily for Ukraine, they had planned for that contingency, and the transport aircraft never arrived. The Ukrainian reinforcements came to the airport first. And that's where the initial 200 troops were vital in stopping the Russian campaign in its tracks. As mentioned earlier, Putin incorrectly assumed that his forces would be welcomed with open arms into the Ukrainian capital. Those 2 hours between the helicopters arriving at the airport and the Russian soldiers raising the Russian flag above the airport were vital in creating enough leeway for Ukraine to mount a counteroffensive. As soon as the helicopters were spotted approaching the Kyiv hydroelectric power plant, the Ukrainian military realized the tactic Putin was using. Luckily for Ukraine, it didn't transport all of its defensive forces to the east. The 72nd Mechanized Brigade, which was split between Kyiv and the small town of Bila Tserkva, 50 miles to the south, as well as the 80th and 95th Air Assault Brigades in the town of Zhytomyr, 70 miles to the west, were some of the units closest to the new battlefield that was the airport. The air assault troops boarded their helicopters and made way to the airport, while the mechanized unit regrouped in Kyiv and, aided by civilian trucks, loaded its heavy armor and carried it part of the way to the airport. The military squads were soon reinforced by veterans and volunteers who took up arms to support the Ukrainian counterattack and prevent Russia from occupying the airport for long. When the mechanized and air assault units approached the airport, they opened fire, not on the Russians, but on the runway itself. The blocked-off runway was now cratered, making it practically unusable for the Russian jets that were expected to arrive within the hour. Instead, the Russian air forces were forced to stop their approach and land somewhere in Belarus. The initial contingent of 300 soldiers that Russia sent via helicopters was all that remained of the invading forces, and they would no longer be expecting reinforcements to arrive via the air. Their only remaining hope was the ground forces arriving via road from Belarus, the same ones that were now fighting through narrow corridors near Chernobyl. At 1500 hours, the last of the Ukrainian reinforcements arrive from Kyiv and surround the airport. The Russian forces are stuck in relatively open plains with minimal buildings and cover to make their final stand. At 1530 hours, Ukrainian President Zelensky gives the order to retake the airport, and the fighting begins anew. To minimize the chance of casualties, Ukraine used artillery strikes to pull the Russian troops away from what little cover they could manage to find. Ukrainian soldiers on the ground noted that what was supposed to be Russia's best troops actually failed to occupy solid defensive positions and were routed from their posts relatively easily. With no reinforcements in sight, the Russian troops are practically surrounded and have to give up their barely fortified position. By 2100 hours, the Ukrainian soldiers claimed to have completely dislodged the Russian troops from the airport, forcing them to take cover in the nearby woods. The 4th Rapid Reaction Brigade, the same men who were on the ground when Russia's strike team approached the airport, posted a video of themselves holding a Ukrainian flag riddled with bullet holes on the now ruined runway. The Ukrainian Ministry of Defense claimed that the invading Russians suffered many casualties, while Ukraine didn't have even one injured soldier on their side, showcasing just how ineffective Putin's plan was for taking over the airport. But the fight was far from over. While the initial helicopter-mounted strike force that was meant to decapitate the government had failed, the Russian reinforcements were still on their way, even if they were delayed by defending Ukrainians. The Ukrainian military knew that it was heavily outmatched and outgunned by the full brunt of the Russian forces. Remember, at this point it only had roughly a fifth of Russia's manpower and a tenth of the equipment, and a decision was made to retreat from the airport and leave it to the Russians. However, Ukraine would leave a parting gift for Putin. The airport's runway was cratered by missiles, rendering it unusable for landing planes, and thus making it useless for any strategy involving flying troops over to the Ukrainian capital. By the morning of February 25th, the mechanized infantry from Belarus managed to fight their way through to Hostomel and retook it in Russia's name. The Ukrainian Ministry of Defense vehemently claimed that the airport itself kept trading hands over the next few weeks as the fighting near Kyiv progressed into a full-blown war. However, the ministry reiterated that the airport was too damaged to be of any use. Instead, the Hostomel Airport and roads leading up to it would be used as supply lines for Ukrainian and Russian forces that were fighting in Bucha, Irpin, and Moshun, Kyiv suburbs between the airport and the city. Ultimately, the suburb of Hostomel and its airport will be the closest Russia's forces managed to get to Kyiv. Ukraine forced Russia to withdraw by April 1st, after which Kyiv was never again besieged by ground forces throughout the war. Thus, the Battle of Antonov Airport devolved from a relatively simple, debilitating strike into a full-blown, weeks-long combat operation that showcased just how badly Russia overestimated its own forces and underestimated the Ukrainian defenses. So how did the Kremlin miscalculate so badly? On the surface, the preamble to the actual battle wasn't as uncommon as you may think. The so-called decapitating strikes on foreign governments are not a new concept. In fact, Russia and its predecessor, the Soviet Union, used pretty much the same tactic 3 previous times. The first such example was the occupation of Prague in 1968. At the time, Czechoslovakia was a Soviet ally that was undergoing a rebellion that became known as the Prague Spring. The first wave of the Soviet invasion involved capturing the Rusnaya International Airport, Prague's main airport, alongside overwhelming amounts of land troops from the Soviet Union, Poland, and Hungary. With the paratroopers occupying the airport, the Soviets could quickly seize control of the Czechoslovakian government, while more airborne reinforcements could be flown in via the newly established air bridge. The country was occupied within a day, and the country's leaders were loaded onto planes and flown out over the next few months, only to be replaced with pro-Soviet loyalists. The Prague Spring showcased how airports were vital military targets and how opposing countries could use them to launch decisive strikes on governments with minimal casualties. The tactic was repeated in 1979 during the invasion of Afghanistan. After the assassination of pro-Soviet leadership in Kabul, Soviet paratroopers took control of the airport, captured the reformed government, and replaced it with Kremlin loyalists again. The resulting occupation didn't go off without a hitch, as the first did, however, with the Soviet Union occupying the cities and the Afghan troops using guerrilla warfare to fight back. The Soviet-Afghan war ended up lasting 10 years, leading to 500,000 military casualties on both sides and 1 to 2 million civilian deaths. However, the modus operandi of the tactic was established. The initial strike to overtake the government was considered to be successful enough to be used as a possible baseline for future invasions. At the height of the Soviet-Afghan war, Vladimir Putin was beginning his career as a KGB agent and would remember the strategy for overthrowing opposing governments at practically no cost. Putin himself would use the tactic for the 3rd time in the country's history, albeit on a slightly smaller scale, in Ukraine. During the 2014 annexation of Crimea, Russian paratroopers landed in Sevastopol, the region's administrative center. Crimea was occupied with almost no shots being fired, and the subsequent sham referendum and annexation would create the long-standing conflict between Russia and Ukraine that would boil over into the war that's been raging for over 30 months now. What went wrong on the 4th iteration of the seemingly flawless tactic that Russia had been perfecting? To put it bluntly, it was hubris. Putin firmly believes himself to be the savior of all former Soviet republics, including Ukraine, and was under the impression that Ukraine's capital would offer token resistance to the paratroopers in Antonov Airport. When the first anti-air missiles were fired outside of Kyiv, those illusions were shattered, and the entire campaign turned into pure improvisation. The forces that were once enough to overtake governments were nowhere near prepared for an extended gunfight in the middle of hostile territory and with no way to get reinforcements to the airport. As mentioned, this wasn't Ukraine's first rodeo of seeing the tactic in action. The country was once in the Soviet Union, and the leading military officers were trained to execute the debilitating strike themselves. When the first strike in Crimea came in 2014, Ukraine was caught unaware. However, the country had 8 long years to improve its military with the help of NATO and create contingency plans to counter the air bridge strategy. The previous iterations of the tactic were successful due to the fact that Russia had an overwhelming aerial advantage compared to the opposition. In contrast, Russia failed to maintain air superiority over Ukraine in any meaningful way. The initial strike force of 34 helicopters was cut down by at least 6 aircraft during the initial battle, and Russia turned back the contingent of transport planes that departed from Pskov. It's highly probable that Russia saw the writing on the wall when the defenses around Hostomel were larger than anticipated and feared that all transport planes would either be shot down or couldn't land on the airfield, of which the latter would be undoubtedly true considering that Ukraine was quick to shell the runway. Russia's inability to conduct a decisive strike on the Ukrainian government was compounded by the delays that the mechanized infantry experienced while crossing from Belarus to Hostomel. This removed any element of surprise Russia could have had and let the Ukrainian military regroup around Kyiv. Russia didn't provide enough supportive artillery or air reinforcements to make a meaningful push toward Kyiv. The initial missile strikes that were supposed to disable Ukrainian radars largely missed or were ineffective, making the Russian helicopters fly practically blind into Ukrainian air defenses. This was compounded by the fact that Russia was used to fighting wars where it had overwhelming aerial advantages and wasn't training its troops to dispatch land-based anti-air defenses. Unfortunately for Russia, Ukraine's military had spent 8 years being modernized by NATO training and doctrines. Likely knowing that Ukraine would continue to be assaulted by Russia after the annexation, NATO divested its own land-based defenses to Ukraine, confident in the fact that they already had an overwhelming air advantage in the hypothetical war against Russia, as the US alone has a larger and more powerful air force than anything Russia can deliver. Furthermore, Putin's arrogance came into effect again when he didn't utilize the entirety of Russian forces to surround the city and let the Ukrainian military reinforce it from the southern supply lines. Ukraine also used scorched earth tactics, blowing up the bridges around Kyiv and releasing the dams on the Irpin and Teteriv rivers, all western tributaries of Dnipro near Kyiv. This flooded the surrounding areas and drastically changed the landscape around the airport. The Russian forces failed to adapt to the altered battlefields now working against them, and Ukraine used the momentum to rout the Russian troops into favorable ambush positions. One such example was the artillery strike on February 27th, which saw a precise strike destroy the lead and rear of a 100-vehicle convoy, leaving the Russians stranded in the middle of enemy territory. The battle at Hostomel illustrates not only why modern military tactics need to learn from the successes and failures of those that came before them, but also why employing a more adaptive strategy could be pivotal in the first few hours of a war. The Kremlin, meanwhile, used a more rigid technique and tried to back it up with a standardized approach that it had used 3 times beforehand, but Ukraine adapted to the operation and foiled the offensive. After that, the battle quickly devolved into even less predictable tactics, for which Russia couldn't compensate with a more meaningful push into Kyiv. The effectiveness of the guerrilla tactics surrounding Kyiv points to the fact that Russia didn't really make a plan beyond the decapitating strike, relying on Ukrainians not fielding enough defenses in the area to succeed. Russia ended up being on the back foot despite being numerically superior and advancing on Kyiv. Before long, Russia would lose much of its advantage in the region and was forced to create a new battlefront in the Donbass. Ironically, that's where Ukraine believed that Russia would come from originally, so Putin ended up playing into Ukraine's plans and lost any initiative he might have had when the special military operation was announced. In the end, the Kremlin miscalculated by believing Ukraine would be a pushover to occupy and failed to prepare a military effort to compensate for a prepared defense force. Instead, Putin relied on a tried and tested but high-risk, high-reward strategy, which ultimately failed and directly caused the loss of the first battle of the Russo-Ukrainian War. Had Russia planned for this failure, it might have mustered up its entire military to create a slightly different first outcome. Or if those 200 Ukrainian soldiers stationed at Hostomel Airport hadn't downed a few helicopters and managed to resist the occupation for more than 2 hours while being outnumbered, the entire operation could have had a much more negative outcome for the Ukrainian government in Kyiv. And that's why the original plan of the Russian invasion of Ukraine was doomed from the start. Russia didn't prepare far enough in advance, and Ukraine mounted enough resistance to prevent the first blow. The war devolved into a game of numbers and technology. Only now, with NATO backing up Ukraine, those points would slowly go in Ukraine's favor. How do you think the Battle of Hostomel Airport shaped the future of the Russo-Ukrainian War? And who do you think will ultimately win, and when? Thank you for watching, and leave your comments below. Now go and check out The True Reason Why Russia Started the War in Ukraine Finally Revealed, or click this other video instead.